Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the AI Sana podcast. Today we have Kieran with us, who is calling in from Brazil. I am calling in from San Francisco, and we are speaking to a Kazakh audience. So, a truly international podcast episode for today. Today, for the session, we are going to be speaking about food and ag. And I'm so excited to introduce you to Kieran because he comes from a long lineage of farmers and he now invests in food and ag and farming. Kieran, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. We're covering all corners of the earth.
Yes, yes,
It's
we
very
are.
interesting, both
Yes,
hemispheres.
absolutely.
Yeah.
That's absolutely true. Um, why, before we start, when you talk about covering all corners of the earth, I looked on your profile, and you have covered all corners of the earth. I don't know if our audience can tell, but you have a slight Irish twang. And
Yeah.
so the slight Irish twang is coming from probably somewhere not in Brazil, and yet you are somehow now in Brazil. What is going on? Who are you,
Yeah.
and how did you get here?
So, yeah, as you detected, I grew up in Ireland on a small dairy farm. So, one of six children. I knew very early on that I didn't want to be a farmer. It was just hard work, right? In Ireland, especially with cold weather, wet, damp, you don't want, and dairy farming is, you have no holidays, right? It's seven days a week, every day of the year. So, I knew very early on that I didn't want to be a farmer. So, I studied. I went to college, got a degree in economics. But unfortunately for me, and this was in the late 80s, there was no financial sector in Ireland at the time. It was a very agricultural economy. And so, like most people that graduated with me, we were forced to emigrate, right? So we had to move abroad to find a job. I tried different places. I lived in New York for a year. So actually, I have a lot of cousins and uncles and aunts living in New York. So my parents, even though they're both Irish, they actually met in New York and got married in New York. So my father lived for 13 years in New York on working on the buildings and different jobs to save up to buy a bigger farm, right? So his father was a farmer. He had like 12 acres. Wasn't enough really to sustain a family. So my father at 18 moved to New York, started working three jobs, and saved up enough money after 13 years to go back to Ireland and bought a bigger farm, about 50 acres. So at least enough to support six kids. And he met my mother, also was there working, and they met, got married in New York, and then moved back to Ireland on the farm. So basically, that's where it started. When I graduated, no jobs, so I traveled a little bit, worked, lived in New York for a year, saw my cousins and my uncles and aunts. Then moved back to Europe, to Paris. I did study French in my first year of college, and I thought, well, let's improve my language skills. So lived in Paris for about 2 years, working with an M&A boutique firm in Paris, but very stressful job. Parisians are not patient in general, but Parisian lawyers are probably the most impatient people on earth. So stayed there for 2 years, and then a friend of mine was doing a round the world trip, backpacking, and I said, "Oh, that sounds interesting." So bought a backpack and went traveling through Asia, Thailand, India, and then Australia, New Zealand, and ended up in South America in Argentina, which was what I was thinking. Maybe I'll stay a year or so in Argentina and learn Spanish. Arrived in Buenos Aires, and it was cold. It didn't feel like I was in South America. Unfortunately, I was in the winter, so I didn't really think about winter in South America, but there is a winter in Argentina. So that was like in July of 1994. And so I met some people, and they said, "Oh, you should go to Brazil. It's much warmer." And they just won the World Cup, and it was a party atmosphere. So this was in 94. So I came to Brazil just thinking I'll travel around for a little bit and see it. And unfortunately, my backpack got stolen on a bus going up to the north of Brazil. So I ended up in the north of Brazil with nothing, just the clothes on my back. I did have my documents. I didn't lose any of that, but I wasn't sure what to do next because I was having great time in Brazil. And I thought, well, people said, "Oh, you should go to Sao Paulo. That's where you can get work teaching English or doing something like that." So I came to Sao Paulo, took a bus. It was a 36-hour bus trip direct from Salvador in the north of Brazil to Sao Paulo. Met some great people on the bus. They told me, "Oh, you should go and stay in this youth hostel," and went. And then the very next day, I got a job teaching English to Brazilian executives in a bank. So it was like teaching the CEO. And when I talked to the school, so it was an ad in the newspaper, and I talked to the school and they said, "Oh, can you start tomorrow?" I said, I could, but I only have I'm wearing shorts and a t-shirt that I've been wearing for the last 3 days of like traveling on a bus. So really, if you could like give me some forward some pay and I could buy some clothes. And they said, no, don't worry, just go as you are. They're really desperate. There was no there was no native English speakers in Brazil back then. So it was like gold dust for them having an English native speaker going into a bank, talking. It was conversational English with the CEO and top directors, and somebody who had a background. I had a master's degree in economics, and who could talk to them about the markets, right? So I went in, and it actually worked out really well, because within a few weeks they offered me a job as a commodities analyst, because they knew my background in farming, and they said, "Oh, you can be." Brazil had just launched the Real plan, which is the currency that came out of hyperinflation during the early 90s, and then in 94 they launched the Real plan, which was a new currency, which is still in place over 30 years later. So it was a success, but basically that opened up the economy to foreigners, and they started importing and having foreign business, and they needed somebody to write about the agricultural commodity space in English, right? Reports and all of that. So that's how I got started. And from there on, it's just been like an opportunity. It was sort of like maybe my father going to the US back in the 60s. It was sort of where the jobs were and where the opportunities were. I ended up in Brazil, and it was sort of like the new frontier for job opportunity, especially in agriculture, right? Without getting my hands dirty, I was actually back in ag and covering at much bigger scale, right? Brazil's capacity as an agricultural producer.
Yeah,
So
I
I'll
love
stop
this.
there before.
Oh my gosh, Karen, you and your dad, between you and your father, the history behind that is like a 4-part like docu-series. Your father leaving home at 18 to go to New York to make money, met your mom, go back to buy a farm. That's like a lot of like historical dramas are based on that exact like storyline.
Yeah.
And
Most people
you,
don't go back though. I mean, and if it was up to my mom, she didn't want to go back. She was having a great time. This was New York in the 60s. They were going out every night dancing. And my dad had this thing in his head that he was a farm boy and he wanted to just make money and go back. And which he did, which is unusual, right? So, because
yeah,
that's why when I mentioned I have more cousins and uncles and aunts living in New York than I do in Ireland,
yeah.
because most of them went and never came back, right? So,
Yeah, yeah. I bet the nightlife is much better in New York than on a 50
for
acre
sure.
farm.
So it was a big shock for my mom moving from New York to a small country farm in rural Ireland, and then suddenly having 6 children.
Yes, right.
Yeah,
And of those 6 children, I think of the this hilarity of you going into a bank in your 3-day old shorts, and and they say, you do you want a job? I mean, like, come on, like, what is it? What are
yeah.
the
No, they
chances?
loved it. I mean, it was Brazil. We Brazilians love foreigners for some reason. It's because maybe not a lot of foreigners come here, so it's off the beaten path. So having a gringo from Europe, and they were all saying, "Oh, why? What are you coming from the first world to this third world country?" And I said, "No, this is not third world. I mean, I saw worse. I was traveling. I mean." Through, through India, especially, I mean, the poverty there was really an eye opener. So coming to Brazil, where there was abundance of like people, food, and nobody was going hungry. So I said, no, this is just a disorganized first world country that has potential, right? So this is good. This is opportunity.
Yes, I love it. I love it. There's so much we can unpack there, but that would take the entire podcast episode. So, but okay. So I want to point something out. You know, you said that in the pre podcast recording, a part of the session, you know, we did a little bit of a get to know you, and you mentioned that you are not a farmer. You are the son of a farmer, you are the brother of a farmer, you are the uncle of a farmer, but you yourself are not a farmer. But you have written about farming for 30 plus years.
Yeah, I've been always involved, and it's sort of ironic because growing up, we had this newspaper called the Irish Farmers Journal, which my father subscribed to, so it would come every week. I never read it when growing up. I never even looked at it, but it turned out in Brazil, I ended up writing a column on Brazilian agriculture. So it's funny that of all the siblings, that I was the one that actually, I mean, least liked farming, ended up being the one that was published in the Irish Farmers Journal. So it was a bit ironic.
I bet your brother's like, what in the world? You don't even
What is he talking about? What does he know about farming?
I love it. Let's talk a little bit about that. I mean, let's talk about what you know about farming. This is the hard part of the podcast. So,
Yeah.
but I'll try to make it enjoyable. I promise. So we, I know that we're talking about farming, but the broader topic is food and ag. And in the session, as we were getting to know each other before this recording, you mentioned that farming is not just about things that happen on the farm. And
Yeah.
so, and I think you mentioned the concept of farming comprehensively has a value chain of lots of different parts, and it can be all encompassed under the category of food, fiber, and fuel. Can you tell us, like, what's food and ag, what's farming, and what were you talking about in terms of food, fiber, and fuel?
Yeah. And maybe I'll step back a little bit just to give context. I think the first, and we'll probably get into it more, but AgTech 1.0 really, I mean, in the US and Europe, started very focused on the farm, right? Very agronomic. So solutions that would help the farmer produce better. So even the name of our fund, the Yield Lab. So it's sort of that was it started in 2014. The only focus at the time for ag tech was in increasing or improving yields, so productivity on the farm. So that was a very narrow vision and a very difficult one, right? Because we have, especially in the northern hemisphere, seasonality. So if you think about it, it's only really you have a very small window of opportunity to sell these solutions to farmers. It's very fragmented. You have logistics of going out to the farm because, especially back then, you had to sort of, there was this concept that you had to look the farmer in the face, eye to eye, to sell him something. He wouldn't, there's no way you would be able to get him to buy something online, right?
Yeah.
So there was a lot of difficulties like that where, and when we came to Brazil, we saw that, well, actually, it's much bigger than just agronomic problems, right? So we have the whole supply chain. So you have the pre-farm gate, which is basically seed, fertilizer, crop protection. So all of that's a huge industry. Then you have post-farm gate, which is logistics, commercialization, buying, trading companies. And then you have all the CPGs that are like the big industries that are processing food. And that's just the food side, right? So then if you think about fiber, so cotton is a big production here in Brazil. A lot of that goes to fiber, clothing. And then Brazil also is a huge bioenergy producer. So ethanol from sugarcane has been a big industry since the 70s. So it's really much bigger than food. But also, even if we just look at food, food is more than just the agronomics of planting and harvesting, right? So really, it's more complex. And when you look at the opportunities in Brazil, that's why I say it's such a good sandbox for ag tech because really you have problems all across the supply chain. Really, in Europe and the US, one of the problems is that most things work, right? So apart from the big challenge for farmers is maybe, as I mentioned in our pre-call, was succession, right? So nobody wants to be a farmer if you have lots of other options and you go off to college and there's lots of more exciting things to do in life. And you also have a limited land supply, right? So you have a small farm that's probably getting smaller if you have to split it between your children. and that's a big problem. So you have to try and produce more with less. So it is an agronomic problem. So there's a lot of focus on biotech, so on seed technology to improve climate resistance, all of that to produce more on less land. Whereas in Brazil, it's the opposite. You had an abundance of land. You have too much land and not being properly or efficiently used. So we have over, I think, 80 million hectares of degraded pasture land. So that's just basically land that's just like very, very badly or very inefficiently being used with a very low stocking rate. And you have all these other problems like access to credit, so financing. So farmers are really, really tied by high interest rates here. Just it's a capital intensive business, farming, and especially if you're doing well, you always need more capital to grow and expand. In Brazil, you're going to be paying at least 20% a year interest rates on any working capital that you need. So that really takes most of your profit. No insurance. So most farmers don't work with any type of crop insurance because it's really overpriced, because most insurance companies are very bad at calculating the actual risk. It's the same for farm credit. It's badly priced. So most banks put all farmers into the same basket of risk and price it off the worst actor in that basket. So even good farmers are penalized by poor farmers. So we have all of these problems. And in Europe and more developed and the US, more developed countries, farmers are sort of comfortable in a lot of ways, where they have minimum prices, they have guaranteed prices, they have logistics and infrastructure. When they order inputs, it comes the next day, and you can even have somebody to apply it. In Brazil, it's much more difficult, right? You have to plan 6 months ahead to buy your inputs, the logistics of getting it there, how do you pay for it? You have to try and get financing, you have no insurance. So there's lots more problems to deal with. And luckily, technology can deal with a lot of those problems. So we started looking at access to credit, right? So we saw that good farmers shouldn't be paying that much interest rates on their credit, because the risk wasn't as high as banks were pricing. So we looked at it, and we sort of studied and saw that, well, the main credit risk for farmers is actually production risk. So when a farmer has a good crop, he'll pay all his debt because he wants to access credit again the following year and plant more and grow. So if he has a good crop, usually it means he's going to pay all his debt, right? So the risk is when he has a bad crop. So how do you know what the chance or the probability is of him having a bad crop? Well, it's actually quite easy. You can look back, especially for row crops like soybeans and corn. You have satellite imagery that was really a game changer, because through satellite imagery and all the data that's collected over that period, you can go back and see how volatile was production on that area that the farmer is using as the guarantee for accessing credit. So if it's been very volatile, where some years he's had a great crop and then the next year he's had a bad crop, that's high risk, right? Because the chances of him having a bad crop next year are much higher. And that might be because he's a bad farmer. It might be because of climate risk in the area he's producing. It might be poor soil, whatever. It doesn't really matter. But if you can sort of map out what his production history has been, you can really give him a much more accurate credit score, because you're really gauging how much production volatility he has and what the chances are of having a good or a bad crop. So basically, we started on that angle, where people that were lending to farmers, and it's not just banks, it's like input companies. So they're selling seed, fertilizer, crop protection to farmers on credit. So they really depend as well on having the farmer having a good crop. So our first investment here was a company called Terra Magna, and they were really tech guys, right? They were geospatial engineers. They had a lot of experience in technology from a top university in Brazil called ITA. And they came to us and they said, "Oh, you guys know about farming, so what can we do with this technology?" And I said, "Well, what do you think you can do with it? What can you do with it?" And they said, "Well, we can predict crops." And we were thinking about, we can predict like crop size. And I said, "That's interesting. So what are you going to do with that?" And they said, "Well, we were thinking of selling that information to the farmers, like a SaaS model where the farm. I said, well, first of all, farmers are not going to pay for that. Either they know what they're going to produce, and if they don't know, they're not going to pay for it. so forget that. So I said, well, let's go to the input resellers and the distributors, right? The guys that are selling to these farmers. So we went out, we visited some distributors, and we asked them, well, how do you manage credit risk? And they said, well, no, we trust all our customers. We know them. We have beers at the weekend. We have barbecues. So we don't. No, that's not a problem for us. Yeah, we trust them. I said, well, what about production risk? Do you know what they're going to produce? And then their faces change. I said, no, we always imagine the worst. We don't sleep at night. So if there's a drought or if there's some disease or something in that area, we always imagine, oh, it's going to be a disaster. So we don't sleep. So I said, well, what if you could know, first of all, the risk of the production, historic risk, and also know what's happening in real time. So in any specific area, and also for areas that are sort of below what historically they've produced, if it looks like it's going to be a bad year, you can take some action like collect more collateral, but also you'll know exactly the day that they start harvesting because you can also predict that with the model. And that'll give you a chance to get in front of the queue to collect your money because farmers never produce nothing, right? They'll always produce something. It'll be a bad crop, but it'll be enough to pay some debt, but not all. So as long as you know ahead of everyone else when he's going to start harvesting, then you can collect your money first. So they love that, and they said, well, when can we have that's amazing? Yeah, can we have that? Like, does it work? And they saw it worked, and it reduced their default levels to zero. And so the next year, the Terra Magna went back and said, oh, we provide a lot of value. We reduced, and typically default levels were maybe 4 or 5% a year, and they reduced to zero. So now we can maybe charge you more money because we started off with a low payment just to get you on board. But now we need to make more money. So what they heard was that basically, well, actually margins are very tight. All of those savings we've already passed on to our customers. And no, sorry, we love your solution. Please don't take it away, but we can't pay any more. So they went back to the drawing board and said, well, basically, we have to come up with a new model. And that model was, instead of the resellers financing the farmer, they said, well, we'll structure credit funds and we'll finance the farmer directly because we can control the credit risk, right? So basically, they set up private credit funds, raised money, and started financing through the resellers, and they were happy about that because it took the risk off their balance sheets, and started financing farmers directly. Now they have a huge business operating like a bank, but much more profitable because they can control the risk, right? So they don't have to overcharge farmers for risk that doesn't exist. They're actually, it's more like precision credit risk modeling, right? So they're actually charging the farmer the real rate, not the sort of theoretical rate. So that was a good example, and we saw, well, that's huge, but that doesn't exist outside of Brazil or Latin America, right? The fintech model. So ag fintech for us was the first area that we got very excited about, and we've made some great investments. So we did that one in Terra Magna for grains. We did an investment in Cultivo, which finances coffee. We did one in AgroForge, which finances animal protein, so dairy, pork, poultry, and beef farmers. Because all of these verticals within ag are very different risk models, right? So with row crops, you can use satellite imagery. It's very easy. It's a good model because you don't even need to talk to the farmer. You just need to know what's happening on his farm. The problem with that model is, though, there's no real barrier to entry. So we have a lot of competition now of other startups creating something similar. So then it's really about whose algorithm is the best, whose works the best. Then you have coffee, which is a sort of a semi-covered crop. So satellite works sort of more or less. It doesn't really show you what the coffee tree is going to produce. It's sort of covered. So you need to combine that with other sources of data on the farm. So on-farm technology, sensors, or something like that. So, or just going and visiting the farm and sort of estimating the crop. Animal protein, that's a tough one because a lot of it's indoor farming. So what AgroForge did was that they they did a partnership with the industry, the co-ops and the dairies that are buying the production from the farmers. They went to them and they said, well, listen, your farmer could be a lot more efficient, a lot more sustainable if he had access to capital. And we will finance improvements on the farm infrastructure, um, things that will help with animal welfare, well-being, like maybe cooling, solar energy, all of that. But we know the farmer doesn't have capital to do that, and if he goes to a bank, it'll be very expensive. We can do that much cheaper if you give us his production history for the past 10 years. Then we will see how much he produces. If he's like a consistent farmer that's producing and growing steadily every year, or if he's a up and down volatile type farmer. So basically, they were able to do credit scores or credit risk scores for farmers within the industry base based on all of that historic production data. And that was good for both sides because the industry then had much better supply source, right, of more technified and using more technology is good for the industry. It also created a little bit of loyalty, especially in dairy, where the co-ops and the dairies were guaranteeing the loans of the farmers. In exchange, the farmer was locked into that dairy for that number of years. So it was a 3 to 5 year loan. The guarantee would lock them in. And that was very important, especially for the milk industry, where they rely on high quality suppliers, and farmers were traditionally not very loyal. They would move their supply to a different co-op if they got like 1 cent higher in prices. So basically there was no loyalty in the dairy
Yeah.
business. It was a sort of dog eat dog. And with this model, it actually helped the dairies sort of lock in some of this supply, at least for a 3 to 5 year period. So there was advantages all around. But basically, just coming back to the original point was that farmers in developed countries are sometimes, even though they complain a lot, are comfortable for a lot of things, right? So they don't really, there's not a lot of problems that you can solve for them. And the problems that you can solve for them are difficult to solve, right? On-farm problems, right, that depend on connectivity, they're seasonal, all of that. So really, in Brazil, we have like just the right amount of problems in terms of inefficiencies, scale. We have like all year round farming. It's very diverse in terms of production. Like, so you're not tied to one crop. So basically, there's a lot of advantages in having a supply chain that's not totally efficient, right? And,
Yeah.
and so it gives opportunity to the startups, and especially using technology to fix those problems has been very scalable as well. So I think when we talk about ag tech in Brazil, especially, it's not comparable to ag tech maybe in the US or Europe.
Yeah.
It's definitely addressing more problems than just agronomic problems.
Yeah. I love that you said that, when you talk about how there's a little bit of inefficiency proves to be a fertile ground for startups. And I want to go back to that what does that fertile ground for startups mean and summarize some of the points that you mentioned. We when we started this question, it was centered around food and ag in the over encompassing category of food and ag can be broken down to depending on what area of food and ag you think of. And it's not just food. Ag includes food, fuel, and fiber. And in food, fuel, and fiber, right? So the agronomics of what's needed to create what you need for food, for fiber, for fuel. There's land management, there's agronomics, there is commercialization, there's logistics, there's financing. So that's the entire market. We've just mapped the market there, but it's so much more nuanced than that. It's so much more nuanced than that because that's if you take the kind of textbook example, the case study example, etc. But you said something about livelihood. So thinking about the actual people behind the supply chain and the market. You talked about livelihood, you've talked about efficiency, you've talked about succession planning. And those three topics are so human centric, right? They're so human centric. The other thing that you covered was you briefly said there are kind of layers of how much moat a startup idea has, and it's the way that you broke it down was that it somehow seemed reliant on the level of data that the farmer needed to provide you. So for example, you said there was an agri-fintech company that you invested in the grain and row crops space, and in that it was easy to get started because all you needed was satellite data. The farmer did not have to be involved in what the solution you created. But in coffee, you needed a little bit more of the farmer's data because it was a covered crop, you couldn't really see the coffee beans, so you needed some on-farm sensors. And so then that was a little bit harder. And then the hardest was in that animal protein because that was all on-farm data. Like you couldn't satellite anything in that space, right? So I love that you kind of broke it down. You started already kind of uh, suggesting the levels of complexity if our students decided that they wanted to pursue ag, and if they wanted to pursue anything in land management, agronomics, commercialization, logistics, or financing. And then you said something at the beginning that I want to go back to. And you said, ag 1.0 was not very effective. It was a little bit of effective, not very effective, and it entirely focused on yield. Didn't really think about the other elements of that supply chain. Didn't really think about um, farming efficiency and succession planning. Help us understand, what is the difference between ag 1.0 and the AI enabled ag 2.0?
Yeah. Okay, so just to go back, we didn't really do Ag Tech 1.0 because it was too hard, right? We
Okay.
stayed away. So the further away you get from the ag part of the equation, which is agronomic, right, on farm, the better your model will be for a startup. So really we focused on the finance. So if you think about banking, banks always make money. It's not seasonal. They make money no matter who's doing well, who's doing badly. Obviously, if there's a big default rate, that won't be a good business for the banks. That's why they tend to stay away from agriculture, because they're not good at measuring that credit risk for farming. But banking is a good business. So startups that focus on good businesses and make it better, that's probably a good place to start, right? If you're a startup founder, right? Start where the money is, and then find the problem in that and make it better, make that model better. So we like that model. I mean, some of our biggest investors are Nestle and Bimbo. Bimbo is like a Mexican, the largest bread manufacturer in the world. Nestle, the largest food company in the world. We tend to avoid actually agricultural companies coming in to the fund, because they're very seasonal, right? So, and it's very cyclical. So farming has good and bad cycles, right? So AgTech 1.0 and AgTech 2.0. So good point, but we actually in a way stayed away from AgTech completely at the beginning, which in the sense that AgTech is focused on farm agronomic solutions, right, to try and make the farm more productive, more efficient. We saw that really agriculture is a very seasonal and cyclical business, right? So farmers some years have very good years, then they have very bad years. So the closer you are to the farm as a business, the more volatile your business will be. So in Brazil, we were lucky that we tended to see problems that were far from the farm. So like financing, credit. We focused initially on, as I mentioned, ag fintech. And if you think about banking, banking is very a good business, right? They make a lot of money, and there's not a lot of volatility. They're always making money. So we thought, well, fintech is attractive VC model. It's very scalable in Brazil. Brazil agriculture represents almost 30% of GDP. So it's probably the biggest industry in Brazil. It's not very efficient. One of the biggest pain points for farmers was accessing credit. They always need credit. It's not even that they just need credit once a year, because they have double cropping, and a lot of them do other activities along with their core business of maybe row crops. So we thought, well, yeah, ag fintech is a good business for a VC, right, to invest in ag fintech, because fintech is very scalable. It's a good model. Everybody knows it. You don't have to be an expert in agriculture to invest in an ag fintech company, because you can see it's growing because it's doing something better than the banks are doing, right? Which is measuring risk much more efficiently. So we started on that, and then we tended to do. We have a logistics, an ag logistics platform. We have a loyalty platform. We have all sorts of like solutions that are not so close to the farm or don't depend on selling technology directly to the farmer. That's the model we absolutely don't want to be in. The business where you're trying to sell to a farmer is probably the worst business you can be in. So we avoided that, and that's luckily what we.
Let's talk a little bit about that. Let's talk a little bit about that, because I love that you said that. You said that, as a VC, inarguably a very good VC, right? You focused on the tech part of ag tech, that is non-farm, so fintech, logistics,
Yeah,
loyalty. 'Cause you said it
problems
was
that were
hard to sell
far
to
from
farmers.
agronomic.
And I
Maybe
don't know
that
how
would be a
many
better
are
framing. So they were problems that farmers
problems
had, but
far
they
from
weren't
agronomic.
agronomic problems. So you took out the hard part of farming, which is seasonality, risk, high risk, and bad cycles, right? So you were looking at an area that was more constant, which is financing the farm. The farm needs to be financed every year. It's a huge market. It's very scalable. It depends on technology that the farmer doesn't need to use, right? He just wants access to financing cheaper and quicker than a bank would offer. So he doesn't need to input any data. He just needs to know that he's getting a good deal on credit and it's coming. Those are the types of businesses, and the loyalty platform. I mean, that's an interesting one, because you're actually bringing something to the farmer, like cash back or loyalty points, in exchange for the data that he's giving you, which is he's going to register and sign up, and every time he buys something,
Mhm.
he'll input that invoice into the platform, because he knows he'll get a reward for it. So he can see the instant value in doing that, right? So whereas if you look at the agronomic stuff, it's hard to use. There was a lot of friction. So going back to your point, AgTech 1.0 was high friction for the farmer to use. It required him to do extra work, right? He had already a busy day, and now he had to do all this input, like stuff at night, inputting data and stuff, and he wasn't even sure if it was going to be of any value, right? Because it was a big time lag in terms of when he would see the actual return or benefits of that investment in his time and money. So that's why AgTech 1.0 wasn't a big success for that reason. It was a very difficult model, especially for VC. It was very difficult to scale. It was fragmented, seasonal. There was a lot of issues around connectivity at the beginning. So out on the farm, the connectivity didn't work. So a lot of your software solutions were useless. So really, we stayed away from all of that. We were lucky because we started in 2014 in the US. Then we expanded to Europe in 2016, and we came to Latin America in 2018, basically with a bit of knowledge about what not to do, right? And also with the advantage that there was a lot of opportunity outside the farm gate, right? A lot of problems that the startups could tackle outside the farm gate that was much more scalable and much more dependable in terms of revenue generation. Now we're actually going back a little bit. So we're stepping back with AI. This has made ag tech possible, right? So I mentioned we didn't do ag tech 1.0, but we will be doing ag tech 2.0. Why? Because now it is possible, right? AI will make technology adoption on the farm much easier, much quicker. Farmers, it's taking out all the friction. So we mentioned in our pre-call, now farmers will get all the benefits without all the work and pain involved, right? You don't need connectivity. So it can be edge computing, it can be on your device, on your cell phone, on your tractor, whatever. You don't need that connectivity. Even though connectivity has improved, it's not really an issue now, but I mean, you don't need it. Farmers won't need to be trying to fiddle with inputting data with fat fingers and dirty hands in the field. So they can like have vision AI. So your camera on the phone can record information, what's happening in the field. Maybe voice AI, so where the farmer actually talks to his phone, which is probably the most common way the farmers actually send messages. It's voicemails. So I think all of that, and AI can deal with any type of data, right? So it doesn't have to be in a certain format or all formatted nicely in a PowerPoint or Excel sheet. So now that makes data collection much easier. And there is a lot of data in agriculture, a lot of data. And as I mentioned, satellite imagery was the first step where you could seamlessly gather data in real time. And that works for row crops, but it doesn't work for every crop, right? So that's why now, if you can gather information in real time of what's happening on the farm, and there's a lot of moving parts, a lot of variables, that's a game changer, right? With that information, then a lot of people are interested, and it's not necessarily even the farmer. There is the agronomic benefit to the farmer, right? He can produce more efficiently, but there's all the other benefit to the people that depend on the farmer, like so the seed producer and fertilizer companies, input companies. They want to know what's happening on the farm because they're planning for next year, right? So what's happening on the farm? What do we have to? What inputs is he going to need? So if they know what's happening on the farm, they can plan and do business much more efficiently. Whoever's financing the farmers as well, right? So the credit risk and the credit needs will be more apparent in real time. Logistics should be a lot easier. Everything, the volatility in the markets will be a lot lower, right? If you know exactly what's being produced in the field and what the weather conditions are and what the climate and all of that in real time. So it takes out a lot of the risk of farming. It makes it more predictable. And I think that's good for everybody. It's not just the farmer, right? So and then we didn't even touch on the climate and sustainability opportunity. I mean, with farming, once you have technology, then you have impact at scale, right? So before, what we had was like impact projects that were not scalable. They were very, very difficult and manual, right? And expensive. So you would have to send people to the field to do audits and verification that the farmer was actually producing sustainably in order for him to receive payments. But it ended up that it was just not an efficient and scalable model. With technology now that initially is coming to look at, agronomic issues that can make the farmer produce more efficiently, it's not just good for him, right? It's good for the final consumer, it's good for the planet because he's using less natural resources. He's more efficient with inputs and chemicals, and he basically produces more with less, and that's good for everybody, right? And especially for the farmer, he should be more profitable and he should be more efficient, more sustainable, and that's where we want to get to. And so eventually, I mean, we were lucky that we had problems to solve while we're waiting for actual AgTech 2.0 to appear. And now that it's here, we will be fully engaged. Our focus is 100% AI first technology for farmers, right? And that's where we're going.
I love that. I love that you said that, with the advent of AI, it makes AgTech 2.0 possible. And that, where that agronomics and the climate impact, etc., that you steered away from because it was difficult in AgTech 1.0, you're now embracing fully because of a couple of things that you mentioned. And I want to point to out to our listeners. One is it makes it frictionless to use. And you mentioned the farmers, but then you also mentioned frictionless to use and benefit from for kind of all the parties involved: farmers, consumers, insurers, anybody involved in the logistics and financing, etc. So I think frictionless. The use of AI will make solutions for farm and food, farm fiber, fuel, frictionless. The other thing that you mentioned is uh, by being able to do more with less data, you improve that frictionlessness, but you also improve the ability to be useful earlier. You don't have the ties to kind of the seasonality. I think in our pre-recording, you mentioned that, in Ag Tech 1.0, you have, in order for a technology to be useful, you had to sell it to the farmer. You had to go through a pilot, which is a whole season. And then maybe that, then you use that pilot data and then maybe you're useful the next season. But the problem is every season, every farm, every farmer, every crop, there's so much variability and volatility that if you could afford to go through a season of pilots, who knows if that data is going to be useful for that next season. So that season, you by being able to use AI, you're removing friction, you're removing kind of the ties to the seasonality. And last, as you mentioned, that you don't need the connectivity like you used to. So by removing the connectivity, now you're able to do things on device, especially if you're able to use things on device you via user in experiences that are tied more to voice or things that are already more natural for farmers. And I love that
Yeah,
you mentioned, yeah, you love. I
there's no
love that you
training. Yeah.
exactly no training, and you mentioned the fat fingers, and I have never ever met a farmer with fragile fingers, delicate fingers.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's the nature of the beast. It's really, you're out in the cold weather and you're working with your hands, and that's what happens. They swell up.
Yeah, never met delicate fingered farmers. So
Yeah.
I want to be mindful of that. I know that you have a hard stop in a couple minutes here. We've talked so much about, the entire supply chain, and then you gave so many examples of individual solutions that you've seen and invested in that resolve those issues. So I want to recap for our listeners here. When we think about this market, let's think about, what it is the output, and we think about food, fiber, fuel. And under all three of those, these are the kind of the areas we can focus on. So land management, agronomics, commercialization, logistics, financing, and last but not least, the climate and climate impact side of it. Now, AI is an interesting, evolution in technology for us as a society. And you know that our listeners are students who will embrace entrepreneurship and AI. Do you have any recommendations or wise words for our students as they're embarking on this journey?
So the big challenge for AI in agriculture, and why I think it's not going to be as fast as maybe other sectors, right? Which is good and bad, but the good part is that it gives you time to work on solutions, and where it's not going to be replaced very easily by the next new model, because it's really all about the data collection. So how you capture data and train your models will be the best models will be the models that have access to the best data, and that can be trained using the best data, right? So really, it's not. I mean, the models are good, but that's really only going to speed up the processing part. But to capture data, you need to be out in the field. So that part's going to take a while, right? So I mentioned maybe wearables, or today most farmers could use their phones to like capture images and record what's happening in the field. But really, farming is still very fragmented, right? Even though in Brazil we have huge scale farms, we also have a lot of small farms. So we have over 5 million farmers in Brazil. So it's still a lot of work. So we know that even though this technology is much easier, right? Because it's really you point and shoot. It's like not really complicated to use. You just need to either capture voice or image, and the AI will do the rest. But it's still hard, right? Because logistics, getting out to the farm, making sure that hardware is there, there's a cost involved. So it's not going to be a winner take all. I think it'll be fragmented, right? So there will be opportunity. Eventually, maybe there will be consolidation, right? Where you have a lot of solutions. Maybe somebody's looking at coffee, somebody's looking at grains, somebody's looking at animal protein. So, I mean, they're all slightly different in terms of what's needed to capture that data. It is all about the data in the end. Once you have the data, and if it's like real time data, even better, because then that's very valuable, not just to the farmer, but to everybody else in the supply chain. And usually, those supply chain people have better margins than farmers. Farmers usually have the worst margins. So they're not the guys you want to have as your customers, right? So
Yeah.
that's why I said it's nothing bad about the farmer. They already have very tight margins. You don't want throwing another cost on top of them, because they're very resistant to that. So you really want to go where the margins are biggest. And I gave that example about Teja Magna with the input resellers. So even though they create a great value, solved an amazing problem, with technology. Those guys couldn't pay anymore, so they had to go back and rethink their value proposition. I have another great example of a water irrigation company startup that we started that was a software to manage water use for irrigation systems that started in Argentina back in 2018. It was very revolutionary. Farmers loved it, but they didn't love to pay for it. So they had a big problem of, yeah, farmers think it's great, but in general, water is free. So they were really saving on energy. So for the irrigation system, it needed energy. When they pivoted their model and they saw, well, they didn't see the farmer as the customer, they saw big tech companies as the customers, where big tech companies are using more and more water and energy for their cloud and AI and servers and all of that. So they went to the big tech companies and said, well, would you be willing to pay farmers to use this technology to compensate or offset your own water and energy usage? And they said, yeah, but only if we can get it at scale. So it's sort of like the idea of like a carbon offset or carbon credits. This was like paying farmers for using technology that would reduce water and energy, but in a very tangible way, right? Different than carbon, where there's a lot of science and conflicting science about how much carbon you're actually sequestering and all of that. So with water, it was actually very tangible, and so they had a very volumetric model where big tech companies would pay farmers for saving X number of liters of water per year. It was very verifiable because the data, it's all digital on the platform, and you could see exactly how much water and energy the farmer reduced while producing more, because a lot of times the farmer was just over watering his plants, thinking that, oh, the more water the better, but it's actually not. So there is an optimal point where once you go past that, the plant will actually produce less. So they were helping the farmer increase yields and do it more efficiently and cost efficiently. But also then they introduced the payment part, which was a game changer, because then the farmer, you're going to the farmer offering him money as opposed to looking for money, which is always the best model, right? So
that's true. When you go to the intended party and offer them money for them to
they were
develop.
suspicious as they would be, but once they saw the contract, they said, well, no, this is like a 5-10 year contract. I'm going to get this money. And they didn't really believe it until the first check came in the mail. But now it works. Now their restraint or their main bottleneck for the startup is actually deploying this solution. They have 5 times more demand than they can meet, right? From
Wow,
farmers wanting it, because it just makes sense. It's free money, right? They're just using something that's good for them, but it's also free money. So it's
free
really
for
about
money.
finding a use for that data, right? So it's all about the technology didn't change. The farmer's still using the same technology. The data before was just being used for agronomic purposes, right? Trying to improve yields using less water. Then they transformed that data into value for somebody else even outside the value chain, right? Which was big tech companies. So they're not even in the ag supply chain, but they saw value in that because it solved the problem for them, which was, well, how do we reduce water and energy with ever growing demand for cloud and AI services that requires a lot of water and energy. So for them, it was a great solution. So that's, I mean, startups have to be innovative in not just in the technology, but in the business model, and look outside the box a little bit. And really the value is in the data, right?
Yeah. I love that you said look outside the box, because in that case, they were looking entirely outside of the supply
Entirely
chain.
outside of,
Yeah. So,
yeah.
Kieran, thank you so much. That's such a great example of how you can find the value proposition from what you've already built, and thinking about a little bit more creatively. One last question for you. Any motivational words of advice for our listeners?
Yeah, I think now it's never been a better time to be a startup founder, right? It's never been easier. With all the tools, I mean, it's getting less and less capital intensive technology, right? It's cheaper and cheaper. So really, it's about being creative and innovative, which is always the fun part of being an entrepreneur, right? So all the other stuff is the hard part, right? Raising funds, going out, doing road shows, all of that. Nobody wants to do that. You want to be playing with technology and making money. So So really now with AI, we're so excited. It's like really the beginning of the internet was sort of like a trial run. This is like hundreds of times bigger because it's really fixing all the problems that we see, and especially in farming, right? With AgTech 1.0 didn't really work that well, but now with AI, I think it's opening up a lot of opportunities for everybody. And yeah, just be optimistic because I think it's very exciting times.
Yeah. That listeners, you heard it here from Kieran. And for somebody who says, do more with less and just be bold and optimistic, I think it would be hard to find someone more optimistic than someone who gets their backpack stolen, goes into a bank in shorts that they've been wearing for 3 days, and lands a job that created a life for them
Yeah.
for 30 years. So thank you so much, Kieran. We're so honored to have had you on the podcast. Thank you so much for your time. We so
Thank
appreciate it.
you. It was a pleasure.
Thank you, everyone. That is another episode of the AI Sana podcast. We covered food and ag and the supply chain. We look forward to seeing you on the next episode. Bye bye, everybody.
Bye bye.